The Robert S. Greenberger Journalism Award recognizes journalists who have fearlessly contributed to principled, independent journalism, who pursue the truth and who ensure that all sides of an issue are reported in a fair and civil manner. In the last several years, Moment has given the Robert S. Greenberger Award to Jake Tapper of CNN and Jane Mayer and Evan Osnos of The New Yorker. We are very excited about NPR's Michel Martin receiving this year's award and about Ted Koppel introducing her.
Scott, thank you very much. Michelle's husband, Billy Martin, is a fine attorney and an all-around splendid fellow, but Michelle and I worked together at Nightline before she married Billy, and back then she was Michelle McQueen. And frankly, Billy, that's a name that suited her to a T. There is something regal about Michelle, which McQueen captured. Don't get me wrong, Martin is a perfectly fine name, but who ever heard of a Queen Martin or a Prince Martin or even a Duke Martin? So it is fitting that Michelle retains McQueen as her middle name. Even as a girl, she marched to her own drummer. She attended St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, at a time when they were only 5 years into this experiment of accepting female students. I can't imagine that there were very many Black students, men or women. By the time Michelle got to Radcliffe College, Harvard's faculty had just barely grown accustomed to the notion that women could somehow rise to a man's academic level. And then, of course, having demonstrated that she was up to the standards of two of the finest newspapers in the world, the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, Michelle switched media and demonstrated her mastery of television journalism at ABC News Nightline, which is where she and I worked together for almost 10 years. As Nightline's managing editor, it sometimes fell to me to assign Michelle to cover a story that involved racism and its devotees. I know from our private conversations that Michelle has drunk fully from the fountains of bigotry. She once told me, in fact, that every African-American family has its own lynching story, not always literal perhaps, but leaving its own set of scars. I know of no one who in private conversation can marshal more impassioned arguments in behalf of bigotry's victims than Michelle. But not once did I ever feel that Michelle allowed her personal feelings to distort her work as a reporter. That used to define the very meaning of good American journalism. I urge you, therefore, to cherish Michelle. She is among the last of a dying breed. A great reporter, a wonderful interviewer, and a profoundly decent human being. That's not simply my opinion. She has a Master of Arts from the Wesley Theological Seminary here in Washington, confirming her humanity. One more personal note. This magazine was co-founded by one of my oldest and closest friends, Elie Wiesel. You could measure Ellie's value as a human being by the enmity of the dictators, racists, and bigots that he earned over the years. I sometimes think, Michelle, that we are more accurately defined by the enemies we make over a lifetime than even by the friends we acquire. Although you are safely defined on both counts. The fact that you are receiving this year's Robert S. Greenberger Award will give heartburn to your enemies and heartfelt joy to your friends, among whom I hope you will always count me.
Thank you, Ted Koppel. Thank you, Moment Magazine. Thank you, Ted. Those words mean more to me than I can say. And I would like to say a few words about Ted. I know this is my moment, as it were, but I want to thank him not only for his kind remarks, which I'm only just now hearing, and I'm struggling to, as you can see, kind of keep it together as I take that in, but for being a mentor and, yes, a friend all these years. And let me be clear, I think Grace Ann would thank me for saying this. His wonderful wife, Grace Ann, would thank me for saying this. He is not perfect. Nothing human is perfect, but he comes pretty close. He was intersectional before intersectionality was cool, drawing upon his own experience growing up in a family that had fled the Nazis to find refuge in a country that was welcoming in a big way, offering refuge from slaughter, but not always in other ways, as in accepting them for who they were and encouraging them to live up to their full potential. You can see that we've had many private conversations, and I remember them all with great gratitude. And I think he drew from that experience to help him seek out and try to understand the experiences of people who don't look like him or sound like him, who also often don't feel safe in their own countries, the countries of their birth, because of the color of their skin or their religion or tribe or other attributes. And that wasn't always cool, but he did it anyway. And he was also a feminist, a person who shared the load at home before that was cool. You may have heard, and if you haven't, I hope it doesn't embarrass me to embarrass him, to recount how he took a job anchoring on the weekends so that his wife, Grace Ann, who'd followed him across the world so that he could live his dream of being a foreign correspondent, could follow her desire to finish her graduate education and become a lawyer, and that didn't come without a price. And as I said, it wasn't cool at the time, and who are we kidding? It's not cool now, but he did it anyway. And he was a person who believed in telling it like he saw it. That is an attribute that you may have observed comes in and out of favor. We are, as my mother would say, sometimey about that in this country. We often like it very much when the person getting the talking to is someone we don't like anyway. We don't enjoy it very much when the person or the people getting that talking to are people we agree with and want to be right all the time. So I appreciate people who say what needs to be said, no matter who needs to hear it, including me. And Ted has always been that person for me. So I want to thank you, Ted, for being that person for me and for so many other people. In fact, for millions of people. Thank you for being that truth-telling person. And I also want to thank, of course, Moment Magazine. Thank you for this wonderful honor, which was quite a surprise to me, I have to say, not just because I'm not Jewish, but also because when I attended the dinner last year as your guest, I coughed through the whole thing, not realizing that I had double pneumonia, true story. Needless to say, I will never do that again. And needless to say, my deepest apologies to the nice lady who sat next to me and gave me several cough drops, which turned out not to be enough. If I find out who you are, I owe you big time. And you can have my place in line whenever they approve the Regeneron for general use. But let me say thank you for trying to be people who say what needs to be said, no matter who needs to hear it. That was certainly Elie Wiesel's story. That was certainly Rob Greenberger's story. And I am so deeply honored to be receiving this honor in both of their names. And as you might imagine, I've been reflecting a lot on this of late, and really for the last few years. Like, I don't know anybody in the fact-based media who isn't reflecting on what it means right now to try to do right by the truth. I mean, does that mean give two sides equal weight, even if one side is based on a fever dream racist fantasy? What does that mean to be fair? What does that mean to be in the fact-based media right now? I mean, those who take their direction from curiosity and go in search of facts, not people who search for facts in the service of their conclusions. It's been a long few years for people who take their marching orders from what they see in front of them and not from people in power who want to tell you what you saw and expect you to repeat it. But we also know it's never been easy to speak truth to power. And I think there's a reason that so many of our sacred texts and our cherished folk tales and even our cherished voices are people who speak of the need to tell the truth despite the cost. to tell Pharaoh, to tell the emperor, to tell the king, to tell the president that he has no clothes, that there is a higher value, there's a higher authority than his word. And it's never been easy, and it's cost many cherished people their lives, not to mention their comfort. And we know this all too well. But here's what concerns me now. It's never been easy to tell truth to power, but in some ways, at least in the world that we live in now, it's easier to speak truth to power than it is to speak truth to friends. Because what we've seen in recent years, and in the last 4 years especially, and even now, is an unwillingness to challenge our own, at least some of our own. And the surveys tell us that we are more divided and tribal in this country than we have been in decades. And I just looked at this data from the Pew Research Foundation, and they reported that this week, even amid the good news that Americans seem to have voted in the 2020 presidential election at their highest rate in more than 100 years, even if, as we kind of celebrate the good news of that historic participation, the continuing political polarization that has come to define the United States cannot be ignored. According to Pew, the data tells us the elected officials who will take their oaths in January are representing two groups of voters who distrust one another, who fundamentally disagree over just about every major problem this country faces. Just take the coronavirus pandemic, which is the reason that we are meeting the way we're meeting now. I mean, there are more than 235,000 deaths in this country to date. The election itself disrupted. 82% of the registered voters who support Biden said in October that the outbreak was very important to their vote. Only 24% of registered voters who support Trump said the same. Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents have expressed far more concern about the virus than Republicans and GOP leaners. And let's talk about the other story, the other major story that we've been covering these last few months, the ongoing fight over racial equality and racial justice. 3/4 of registered voters who support Biden said in the summer that racial and ethnic inequality would be very important to their vote. Just 24% of Trump voters agreed. And the two sides are miles apart when it comes to general questions about race, too. Over the summer, 74% of Biden voters said it's a lot more difficult to be a Black person in this country than to be a white person, which is a view shared by, wait for this, 9% of Trump voters. So let's think about how hard that is to bridge these divides over basic facts, over the basic truth of the status that our country is in now. The bottom line is that this has become a country in which political party has become an all-consuming identity, which is very strange in a country that prides itself on individualism and thinking for yourself. And it seems as though that is a skill that many of us have lost. And at a time like that, it strikes me that the people we most need to speak truth to are our friends, because they are often the only people we're actually talking to. And what does that mean? It means we need to have hard conversations with the people who are listening to us in our own circles and try to avoid becoming amen corners of our own. And I know this is hard, especially when you feel that you or your side is under attack and the other side, as it were, isn't playing by the rules as we understand them. But there is no more truth if we refuse to accept truth, and there are no more facts if we cannot accept facts. There is no chance we can arrive at a common understanding of the truth if we don't hold ourselves to that standard. And so another reason I appreciate Moment is that in your own way, you try to speak truth to your friends as well as to those in power. And I know that that's not easy to do. And I recognize that many of the people who are listening to our conversation will say, well, it's words, it's lawsuits, it's just words. I've seen worse, and there has been worse. But I think we all know, at least I hope we all know, that actions start with words. Our words have to matter. And I'm going to go back here to another of the great atrocities of our era, the massacre in Rwanda, which was once again one of my proudest moments to be associated with Ted Koppel and with Nightline. This was not a story that I had the honor to cover myself, but many of my colleagues did under your direction, Ted. And because I was so moved by our coverage, I made a point of reading Paul Rusesabagina's memoir. You may remember that he saved more than 1,000 people's lives, both Tutsi and Hutu, during the 1994 Rwanda massacre when he was the manager of the Hotel des Mille Collines. It's a story that was recounted later in the movie Hotel Rwanda. And I read his memoir, and it struck me to my core. It struck me to my core to hear from him how it all started with radio shows like mine. Radio shows like the ones that Ted started with in his career, radio shows that got great ratings because they were fun and jazzy and lively to listen to, but which at some point took a turn to dehumanizing people of different tribes, calling them parasites and bugs and worse. And we all know how that turned out. 800,000 people were killed in the span of 100 days. Mr. Rusesabagina was and remains a hero because he refused to listen. He was loyal to humanity and to his values, not to tribe, and everybody under his roof was deemed equally worthy of protection. And it strikes me that this kind of horror, this slippery slope to dehumanization, seems very easy to spot in other people's countries and somehow very hard to spot in our own. Epithets, name calling have become the lingua franca of our national discourse. And I will say it, yes, I'll say it. It seems that one side has become more attached to this than another, but that is all the more reason why those who don't agree with this have to hold the line. We have to hold the line. It strikes me that many of us who believe in this kind of discourse of civility and calmness and fairness are often viewed as corny or as old-fashioned. But holding to values is not old-fashioned. Holding to values is exactly what it is. And that doesn't mean we have to be blind to the techniques of storytelling, to the modern ways that we want to get our stories out, but it does mean we have to hold the line. We have to hold the line on civility. We have to hold the line on fairness. That doesn't mean we can't rethink some of our methods. It doesn't mean that we can't rethink some of our techniques. It doesn't mean we have to give into both-siderism, where both sides, as it said, are considered equally true or value when a side is not telling the truth. But it does mean we have to hold the line on our values, even when other people don't think it's fashionable, even when people might think it's corny, even when people might think that we're sort of out of step. Because it starts with words. It starts with all of our words. And I say all this, and I know that you know this, especially the people who are part of our conversation now. You know, the arc of the moral universe may bend to justice, but that arc seems really long right now, which is all the more reason why those of us who believe in these values of truth cannot rest and cannot relax. We have to hold the line on decency. We have to hold the line on truth. And we have to hold the line on science. And we have to hold the line on facts. Because if we don't, well, that future is just too bleak to contemplate. And having said that, I want to thank you all again for this wonderful honor, which means more to me than I can say. And I want to thank you again, Ted, for being my friend, for being a mentor, for being a guide, but really, most of all, for being a truth teller.